No romantic fiction, just rigorous historical and literary analysis.
The Third Era, Ovid, Pausanias, and Pseudo-Apollodorus. Finally, we will conclude with the Third Era, dominated by Ovid's vision in his Metamorphoses and the mythographic syntheses of Pausanias and Pseudo-Apollodorus. This is where the Medusa the modern world remembers best is born, the beautiful maiden desecrated and punished by Athena. This is the era of psychological synthesis, where the monster becomes a victim and a symbol, a definitive transformation that shifts the myth's center of gravity from fear to pity, influencing art and culture to this day.
Ovid, a poet of the Augustan age, reworks the myth of Medusa by introducing a crucial element that would have an enormous influence on subsequent tradition: transformation as punishment. In the Metamorphoses, the poem dedicated to transformations, the story of Medusa is narrated by Perseus himself during a banquet. According to Ovid's account, Medusa was not born monstrous. On the contrary, she was a maiden of exceptional beauty, forma fuit laudem capiens, whose most admired and envied feature was her magnificent mane of hair. In tota nullior pars fuit capillos. Her beauty attracted many suitors. Poseidon, the ruler of the sea, became enamored of her and violated her within the temple consecrated to Athena in Ede Minervae. Athena, outraged not by Poseidon's act but by the desecration of her sacred space by her priestess, decided to punish not the god but the maiden. So as not to defile her shield with an impure gaze, the goddess turned away and transformed Medusa's splendid hair into a tangle of hissing snakes. This punishment, according to Ovid, was an act of just revenge, iusta discenda vindicta. From that moment on, anyone who met Medusa's gaze would be turned to stone. Ovid then describes in detail the use Perseus makes of the severed head. He petrifies the Titan Atlas, turning him into a mountain. He terrorizes his enemies during the battle in Cepheus's palace, turning Phineus and his followers into statues. And finally, he punishes Polydectes on Seriphos. The poet also adds an etiological detail. As Perseus flies over Libya, drops of blood fall from Medusa's head and upon touching the hot sand generate the various species of venomous snakes that infest that region.
Pausanias, the historical rationalization of the Medusa myth. Pausanias the Periagete, a Greek writer and geographer of the 2nd century A.D., offers in his description of Greece, Helados Periegesis, a unique and rationalizing perspective on the Medusa myth. Unlike the poets, such as Homer or Hesiod, or the tragedians, such as Aeschylus, Pausanias functions as an antiquarian and traveler who observes monuments, tombs, and local traditions. His contribution is fundamental because it documents the persistence of the myth within the physical landscape of Roman Greece and introduces a historical version of Medusa, stripping her of her monstrous traits to transform her into a political and military figure of ancient Libya.
The Tomb of Medusa in Argos, Book 2, 21, 5-6. During his visit to the city of Argos, Pausanias describes a monument that testifies to the profound link between the city and the hero Perseus. The earthen mound. Pausanias reports the existence of a mound that the inhabitants of Argos identified as the burial site of the Gorgon's head. Not far from the marketplace of Argos is a mound of earth in which they say lies the head of the Gorgon Medusa. Description of Greece 2:21-5. This testimony is extraordinary because it suggests that for the Argives, Medusa was not merely an image on a shield, but a physical being whose mortal remains were preserved and venerated, or feared, as a civic relic.
The rationalization of the myth, Medusa as Queen of Libya.
Pausanias, reflecting on the nature of Medusa, reports an alternative and historical version of the myth, attributed to Carthaginian sources, such as Procles, son of Eumenes. Medusa as a military leader. In this version, Medusa loses her serpentine hair and petrifying gaze to become a warrior sovereign. Medusa, after the death of her father Perseus, reigned over the peoples dwelling around Lake Tritonis in Libya. She led the Libyans in battle and went hunting, but was killed by treachery at night by Perseus, who led a select army from the Peloponnese. Description of Greece, 2:21, 5, 6. Pausanias adds that Perseus, admiring the beauty of Medusa's face even after death, decided to bring her head to Greece to show it to the inhabitants of the Peloponnese. This interpretation transforms the mythic feat into a colonial military campaign, where the monstrous is merely a poetic distortion of a historical reality of conflict between Greeks and Libyan populations. Sacred Iconography, Medusa and Athena. Pausanias also documents the constant presence of the Gorgoneion, the head of Medusa, in the most important sanctuaries of Greece, confirming its role as a divine attribute. The statue of Athena Parthenos, Book 1, Chapter 24, Section 7. Describing Phidias's famous chryselephantine statue in the Acropolis of Athens, Pausanias notes, "On the breast of the goddess, Athena, is worked in ivory the head of Medusa." Description of Greece, 1:24, 7. The Temple of Zeus at Olympia, Book 5, Chapter 10, Section 4. Pausanias also describes the external decorations of the Temple of Zeus, where the Gorgon serves as a protective and decorative element. On the summit of the pediment is placed a gilded Victory, and beneath the statue of Victory hangs a golden shield upon which the Gorgon Medusa is depicted. Description of Greece, 5:10, 4. These observations demonstrate that in the 2nd century AD, the image of Medusa remained omnipresent in places of worship, maintaining its function as a guardian of the sacred and a symbol of the power of Athena. Academic analysis and interpretation. Pausanias's approach to the Medusa myth reveals 3 trends of Imperial-era culture. 1. Euhemerism and rationalization. Pausanias seeks to explain the myth through history and geography. The Gorgon is not a monster, but a foreign queen. This reflects the era's desire to reconcile mythical tradition with historical reason. 2. Myth as landscape. For Pausanias, myth is place. The tomb at Argos makes the story of Perseus tangible and real, anchoring collective memory to physical monuments. 3. Iconographic continuity. Despite intellectual rationalization, Pausanias recognizes the religious value of the Gorgoneion. Medusa's head remains an indispensable element of the divine majesty of Athena and Zeus.
Conclusion. Pausanias presents us with a monumental and historical Medusa. Through his eyes, we see how the myth survived not only in books, but in the stones of temples and the mounds of cities. His version of the Libyan queen killed in war offers a fascinating bridge between the world of the marvelous and that of ancient chronicle, rendering Medusa a figure suspended between legend and historical reality.
The work known as the Bibliotheca of Pseudo-Apollodorus offers the most systematic and comprehensive narration of Perseus's quest, organizing the various preceding traditions into a single, coherent account. The narrative begins with the challenge imposed on Perseus by Polydectes, king of Seriphos, who, desiring to marry his mother Danae, orders the hero to bring him Medusa's head, believing it to be a suicidal mission. Guided by Athena and Hermes, Perseus begins his search. First, he must find the Graeae, the sisters of the Gorgons, who are the only ones who know the way to the Stygian nymphs. Perseus compels them to reveal the secret by seizing the single eye and single tooth they shared. Once he has the directions, Perseus reaches the nymphs, from whom he receives 3 indispensable magic items: the winged sandals to fly, the kibisis, a magical pouch to contain the head without being petrified, and the helmet of Hades, kine, which renders its wearer invisible. Hermes also provides him with an adamantine sickle, harp, for the decapitation. Thus equipped, Perseus flies to the ends of the ocean and finds the Gorgons asleep. Athena guides him, pointing out which of the 3 is Medusa, the only mortal one. Following the goddess's advice, Perseus never looks directly at the monster, but instead observes her image reflected in the polished bronze shield that Athena holds out to him. Approaching in flight, with his hand guided by the goddess, he decapitates Medusa with a single, sharp blow of the sickle. Immediately, Pegasus and Chrysaor spring forth from the severed neck. Perseus places the head in the kibisis and flees, while the immortal sisters, awakened by the commotion, launch in pursuit. Thanks to the helmet of Hades, which makes him invisible, Perseus manages to escape. On his way back, he performs other feats, including the petrification of Atlas and the rescue of Andromeda. Upon returning to Seriphos, he pulls out Medusa's head and petrifies Polydectes and his supporters. Finally, he returns his magical gifts. He gives back the sandals, the kibisis, and the helmet to Hermes, who returns them to the nymphs, and gives the Gorgon's head to Athena, who affixes it to the center of her aegis, her divine breastplate. In-depth academic analysis. Analysis based on chronological secondary sources. Jean-Pierre Vernant in 1985, La mort dans les yeux. Jean-Pierre Vernant's analysis, presented in his essay La mort dans les yeux, Death in the Eyes, deconstructs the figure of Medusa, moving her away from the idea of a mere monster to elevate her to a symbol of a radical and terrifying otherness. For Vernant, the Gorgon is not an entity to be understood through a biographical narrative, birth, life, death, but through her function, to be a face that, when looked at, deals death. Medusa's power resides entirely in her face, in her frontal gaze that inverts the normal relationship between subject and object. Typically, the one who looks is the active subject. In front of Medusa, the gaze is objectified, turned to stone, rendered a non-thing. This power makes her the absolute other, a figure of the unseen that cannot be seen, a terrifying mask that represents the very face of death. Her head, the Gorgoneion, is an image that fixes the beholder in a cadaverous immobility, making them identical to the mask itself. Vernant emphasizes that Perseus, to defeat her, cannot confront her directly. The hero must resort to a series of cunning tricks and magical tools that place him in a state of non-gaze. The helmet of Hades that makes him invisible, and the bronze shield that functions as a mirror. The mirror is crucial. It allows Perseus to see Medusa without being seen, to capture her image without meeting her lethal gaze. The hero triumphs through intelligence, metis, the same quality as Athena, his protector. The decapitation does not nullify the Gorgon's power. On the contrary, it makes it mobile and usable. The severed head, now affixed to Athena's aegis, becomes an apotropaic weapon, a symbol of the terror that the goddess can unleash against her enemies. The monstrous mask is thus integrated into the divine and civic order, placed on the breast of the goddess of war and reason. For Vernant, Medusa represents the transition from chaotic and primordial terror to a terrifying power that is controlled and functional within the divine cosmos and the polis. Walter Burkert, in his study The Orientalizing Revolution, Near Eastern Influence on Greek Culture in the Early Archaic Age, situates the iconographic and conceptual origin of the Gorgon within a broader process of cultural transmission from the Near East to Greece. Burkert argues that the figure of Medusa is not a purely Greek invention, but an adaptation of a Mesopotamian demon, Humbaba or Huwawa. Humbaba is the guardian of the cedar forest in the Epic of Gilgamesh, a monstrous being whose face is described as a tangle of lines resembling intestines. Babylonian depictions of Humbaba show a terrifying face, often with a lolling tongue, fangs, and a fixed stare, features that would become canonical in the archaic iconography of the Greek Gorgon. Like Medusa, Humbaba is an apotropaic creature whose face has the power to paralyze and terrorize. Burkert highlights stringent parallels between the myth of Gilgamesh and Enkidu killing Humbaba and that of Perseus decapitating Medusa. In both narratives, two heroes, Gilgamesh and Enkidu, Perseus aided by Athena, confront a guardian monster in a remote land. After killing it, they cut off its head and carry it away as a trophy. This head retains its terrifying power even after death. According to Burkert, the transmission of this figure would have occurred during the Orientalizing period, an era of intense commercial and cultural exchange between Greece and the civilizations of the Levant. Greek artisans and poets would have absorbed the image and function of the demon Humbaba, reworking and integrating it into their own mythological system under the name of the Gorgon. The Gorgon, therefore, is none other than the Hellenized version of a Near Eastern demon, a striking example of how archaic Greek culture was formed through the creative reception and transformation of external influences. Maurizio Bettini, 2013, The Grand Narrative of Classical Myths. Maurizio Bettini analyzes the myth of Medusa by focusing on the logic of reciprocity and symbolic exchange, particularly through the theme of the gaze. In his work, Bettini interprets the story of Perseus and Medusa as a narrative constructed upon a series of denied gazes and exchanged gazes. Perseus's quest begins with a visual deception. To force the Graiae to cooperate, the hero seizes the single eye they share, depriving them of sight. This act of theft of the gaze is the key that grants him access to the tools needed to face Medusa. The mission itself is defined by a visual prohibition: do not look at the Gorgon. Bettini places emphasis on the bronze shield as a mediating device. The shield is not a mere protection, but a tool that allows for an indirect gaze. Perseus does not see Medusa, but her reflection, eidolon, a disempowered image. He kills an image to destroy the reality, operating on a plane of visual cunning. This stratagem breaks the lethal power of Medusa's direct gaze, which petrifies anyone who looks at her, turning them into an object, a statue. Perseus, by refusing the direct visual exchange, avoids becoming an object himself. Once decapitated, Medusa's head itself becomes an object that can be exchanged. Perseus uses it to repay his enemies, Polydectes, and his obstacles, Atlas, turning them to stone. The gaze that could not be met becomes a weapon to be wielded. The final act is the presentation of the head to Athena, which places it on her aegis. This, for Bettini, is the ultimate gift that settles the hero's debt to his patron goddess. The head of Medusa, an object of terror, is integrated into the divine system as a symbol of Athena's power. The myth, therefore, is configured as a complex chain of exchanges, a stolen gaze from the Graiae to obtain the tools to capture a lethal gaze, Medusa's, which in turn becomes an object to be exchanged to settle a debt with Athena.
Subscribe to the channel.
If this content pleased you, I invite you to like it, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next videos. Your support truly encourages me to keep creating content like this.